I'm William Lester, Professor of Chemistry and Chair of the Hitchcock Professorship Committee. We're pleased to welcome Professor Amartya Sen, this year's speaker in the Charles M. and Martha Hitchcock Lecture Series. As a condition of this bequest, we're obligated and happy to tell you how the endowment came to UC Berkeley. It's a story that exemplifies the many ways this campus is linked to the history of California and the Bay Area. Dr. Charles Hitchcock, a physician for the Army, came to San Francisco during the gold rush, where he opened a thriving private practice. In 1885, Charles established a professorship here at Berkeley as an expression of his long-held interest in education. His daughter, Lily Hitchcock Coit, still treasured in San Francisco for her colorful personality as well as her generosity, greatly expanded her father's original gift to establish a professorship at UC Berkeley, making it possible for us to present a series of lectures. The Hitchcock Fund has become one of the most cherished endowments of the University of California, recognizing the highest distinction of scholarly thought and achievement. Thank you, Lily and Charles, and now a few words about Professor Amartya Sen. Professor Sen is credited worldwide for his invaluable contributions to research on fundamental problems in economics and philosophy. His theoretical and empirical work encompasses a range of issues, from famine and poverty to social choice theory, decision theory, and the demands of rationality and freedom. Sen is widely recognized for the powerful sense of ethics and common humanity in his work on economics and philosophy. Sen has held professorships at several universities, including the Delhi School of Economics, the London School of Economics, Oxford University, and Harvard University. In 1998, he left his professorship at Harvard to become the master of Trinity College, Cambridge. In 2004, Sen left the post of master but remains a fellow of Trinity College. Upon his return to the philosophy and economics departments at Harvard, Sen was named the Lamont University Professor, a position which he previously held from 1988 to 1998. Sen's achievements have been recognized with many honors. He is a fellow of the British Academy and a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and has served as president of the Econometric Society, the International Economic Association, the Indian Economic Association, and the American Economic Association. Sen holds over 75 doctorates from internationally renowned universities. In 1998, he won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in social choice theory, the philosophical and mathematical inquiry into links between individual values and collective choice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Amartya Sen.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege for me to be able to give the Hitchcock Lectures, and also wonderful for me to be back at Berkeley. I had the wonderful opportunity of teaching here for a year, 40 years ago, in 1964-65, a year of some moment. I don't think I can take much credit for it. Even though I ought to confess that I was visiting Harvard in 1968-69, and I was in Columbia in the spring of '68, and in Paris in the summer of '68. I think any kind of factor analysis would have identified me, but that is part of the reason for my skepticism of some of the methods that we often use. I'm also very grateful to Professor Lester for her very kind words, and to the Hitchcock Committee and to the Foundation for kindly inviting me. Today's lecture is titled The Violence Revolution, as a part of 2 talks on identity and violence, so I'll get on with it now. Langston Hughes, the African-American writer, describes in his 1940 autobiography, The Big C, the exhilaration that seized him as he left New York for Africa. He threw his American books into the sea. He describes it as like throwing a million bricks out of my heart, unquote. He was on his way to his, quote, Africa, motherland of the Negro people. Soon he would experience, quote, the real thing, to be touched and seen, not merely read about in a book. Hughes' hurling of books was not only an expression of his new sense of freedom associated with the imminent realization of his African identity, it was also an evocative gesture of social protest. Indeed, the perception of identity has done much to generate and sustain demands for fairness and justice across the world. Movements for women's equality have drawn heavily on the sense of feminist identity of early champions of gender justice, such as Mary Wollstonecraft, and of pioneering suffragettes like Emmeline Pankhurst. The world would be a more impoverished place without the social and political commitment directly inspired by the identity of disadvantaged people with their fellow underdogs of society. A sense of identity can be a source not merely of pride and joy, which it certainly is, but also of strength and confidence. And yet, identity can also kill, and kill with abandon. A strong and exclusive sense of belonging to one group can go with the perception of distance and divergence from other groups, and can contribute to fomenting conflicts organized around group categories. Within group solidarity can go hand in hand with between-group discord. Any kiddie in school can love like a fool, Ogden Nash has claimed, but hating my boy is an art. That art is widely practiced by skilled artisans and instigators, and the weapon of choice very often is identity. We may be suddenly informed that we are not just Rwandans, but specifically Hutus. We hate Tutsis. Or we are not really mere Yugoslavs, but actually Serbs. We absolutely don't like Albanians. From my own childhood memory of Hindu-Muslim riots in the 1940s, linked with the politics of partition, I recollect the speed with which the broad human beings of January were suddenly transformed into ruthless Hindus and fierce Muslims of July. The broader identities that got suppressed during those brutal moments would return again before long, within a few years, as the storm passed. But meanwhile, hundreds of thousands perished at the hands of people who, led by the commanders of carnage, slayed others on behalf of their quote-unquote own people. Violence is fomented by the imposition of singular and belligerent identities on gullible people, championed by proficient artisans of terror. But to see all this just in terms of the machinations of wily instigators would be to miss out a central feature in the causal process involved in identity-based violence. There has to be some deep vulnerability in human comprehension that provides fertile ground for exploitation and manipulation on which the instigators draw. The currency of group love leaves room for an invitation to group hatred. The cordiality of identifying with others in an affiliative group seems to stand in some readiness to be extended to scalding or burning others excluded from and seen as enemies of one's own affiliated group. Identity is a double-edged sword. The constructive contributions of identity-oriented ideas come closely mixed with the more damaging potentials. The connection of identity-based thinking with the fostering of violence deserves a closer examination than it tends to get. The latter needs more investigation right now, both because it is important and because the former, the positive contributions, have been rather excellently researched in recent years. Our understanding of the role of identity has been very substantially enhanced by new explorations of social psychology and public action. Even though a good deal of traditional economic theory is seriously limited because of its exclusive reliance on the assumption of narrowly self-interested conduct, there have been very important recent developments in incorporating identity-based thinking in the characterization of economic behavior and in investigating the far-reaching accomplishments of this motivational broadening. The contributions of George Akerlof here, and indeed here in this hall, with Rachel Cranton, have been particularly far-reaching in incorporating the functioning of identity and its positive role in economic and social behavior, with complexities of various kinds, which he has analyzed here, as George Akerlof has analyzed other complexities of behavior in his earlier work. Also, our understanding of the constructive role of a sense of identity has been substantially enriched by the discernment of the positive effects of so-called social capital by Robert Putnam and others, in the form of people's propensity to help others in the same community with a spontaneity that would be hard to generate by narrowly self-centered behavior of intellectually isolated human beings. Similarly, communitarian theory and philosophical reasoning influenced by that line of thinking, well illustrated, for example, by the contributions of philosophers from Charles Taylor to Michael Sandel, have also brought out the positive role played by the recognition of identity with one's own community in yielding impressive social achievement at a reflective as well as material level. What has to be added to the understanding generated by these investigations is the basic recognition that a sense of identity can firmly exclude many people even as it warmly embraces others. The well-integrated community in which residents instinctively do wonderful things for each other with great immediacy and solidarity may also be the same community in which bricks are thrown through the glass windows of immigrants who move into the region from elsewhere. The adversity of exclusion goes hand in hand with the gifts of inclusion. The so-called social capital may actually fail to be capital in the basic economic sense of being an all-purpose resource to promote desirable objectives in general, since the same social disposition may make the lives of some, the outsiders, much more barbed, even as it helps the lives of insiders to flourish more fully and more easily. And when things get really tense, the affection and the sense of oneness with others in the same community or group may serve as a fertile ground for incitement to unleash brutalities on others seen as members of rival or hostile groups. The violence associated with identity conflicts seems to repeat itself around the world with dogged persistence. Happily, the horrors of Yugoslav genocide have subsided, and the killing of Albanian Muslims, targeted by those who share the ruthlessly single-minded Serbian identity, has been stopped. But other barbarities across the lines of divisive identities continue. Even though the balance of power in Rwanda and Congo may have changed, the targeting of one group by another continues with much force. The marshalling of the aggressive Sudanese Islamic identity from the north continues to lead to the raping and killing of overpowered Christians in the south of that appallingly militarized polity. Israel and Palestine continue to experience the fury of dichotomized identities ready to inflict penalties on the other side. Al-Qaeda relies heavily on cultivating and exploiting a militant Islamic identity specifically aimed against Western people. And reports keep coming in from Abu Ghraib and elsewhere that the activities of some American or British soldiers sent out to fight for the cause of freedom and democracy included what is called, quote-unquote, softening up of prisoners in utterly inhuman ways. We must, of course, go beyond putting the responsibility for these terrible transgressions entirely on some bad apples. But we must ultimately also go beyond scrutinizing the chain of command coming from above, essential as that scrutiny undoubtedly is at this moment. It's necessary to examine, in addition, why the apples in general carry in them the possibility of harboring warmth, and how human beings with normal family and societal background can act with apparent glee in such nasty and cruel ways, with or without commands coming from higher officers. Unrestrained power over the lives of suspected enemy combatants or presumed miscreants bifurcates the prisoners and the custodians across a hardened line of divisive identities. They don't think the way we do. It seems to crowd out often enough any consideration of other, less confrontational features of the people on the opposite side of the breach, including, among other things, their shared membership of the human race. If identity-based thinking can be amenable to such brutal manipulation, where can the remedy be found? It can hardly be sought in trying to suppress or stifle the invoking of identity in general. For one thing, identity can be a source of richness and warmth, as well as of violence and terror. And it would make little sense to treat identity as a general evil. But more immediately, an attempt to suppress identity-oriented thinking is unlikely to have any success at all. That is, a forceful suppression. And a sustainable solution to the problem of identity-based violence has to be sought in a fuller use of human freedom, rather than in authoritarian forbiddance. Rather, we have to draw on the understanding that the force of a bellicose identity can be challenged by the power of competing identities, which include, of course, the broad commonality of our shared humanity, but also many other identities that everyone simultaneously had, which classify people differently and which can restrain the exploitation of a specifically aggressive use of a particular categorization. What makes the divisiveness of an imagined and unique identity potentially so brutal and relentless is not the mere presence of that divergence, but the overlooking of other identities that human beings also have, and which too can claim our attention. A Hutu laborer from Kigali may be pressured to see himself only as a Hutu and incited to kill Tutsis. And yet he is not only a Hutu, but also a Kigalian, a Rwandan, an African, a laborer, and a human being. Along with the recognition of the plurality of our identities and their diverse implications, there is a critically important need to see the role of choice in determining cogency and relevance of particular identities which are inescapably diverse. The use of identity-based thinking in generating conflict and violence is closely connected with the illusion that identity is just a matter of quote-unquote discovery, rather than also of reasoning and choice. Encouraging that illusion of destiny can be an integral part of the martial art practiced by the architects of sectarian violence. That is plain and obvious enough. But it is important to see that this illusion receives well-intended but rather disastrous support from practitioners of a variety of respected and indeed highly respectable schools of thought. They include, among others, dedicated communitarians who take the community identity to be not only paramount, but also predetermined, as if by nature, without any need for human volition, just quote-unquote recognition, and also unswerving cultural theorists who partition the people of the world into little boxes of disparate civilizations with no residue left behind. So the next step in this investigation has to be an elementary examination of the basic idea of identity and how it operates. In our normal life, we see ourselves as members of a variety of groups. We belong to all of them. The same person can be, without any contradiction, an American citizen of Caribbean origin with African ancestry, a Christian, a liberal, a woman, a vegetarian, a long-distance runner, a historian, a school teacher, a poet, a feminist, a heterosexual, a believer in gay and lesbian rights, a theater lover, an environmental activist, a tennis fan, a jazz musician, and someone who is deeply committed to the view that there are intelligent beings in outer space with whom it is extremely urgent to talk, preferably in English. Each of these collectivities, to all of which this person simultaneously belongs, gives her a particular identity. None of them can be taken to be the person's only identity or singular membership category. Many communitarian thinkers tend to argue that a definitive communal identity is only a matter of self-realization, not of choice. As my colleague and close friend, Professor Michael Sandel, has explained this claim, I quote, "Community describes not just what they have as fellow citizens, but also what they are." This is in his book on liberalism and limits of justice. So what they are, not a relationship they choose, as in a voluntary association, but an attachment they discover, not merely an attribute, but a constituent of their identity, unquote. In this constitutive conception of community, Sandel argues, I quote, "The self comes by its end, not by choice, but by reflection as knowing or inquiring subject to object of self-understanding," unquote. A person's identity in this view, something he or she detects rather than determines. Social organization can then be seen, in the words of another eminent communitarian theorist, Crowley, from his book, The Self, the Individual, and the Community, as attempts, I quote, "to create opportunities for men to give voice to what they have discovered about themselves and the world, and to persuade others of its worth," unquote. It's hard to imagine that a person really has no substantial choice between alternative identifications, and that she must, quote unquote, discover her identities, as if it's a purely natural phenomenon, like determining whether it's day or night. In fact, we are all constantly making choices, if only implicitly, about priorities to be attached to our different affiliations and associations. Often such choices are quite explicit and carefully argued, like when Mohandas Gandhi deliberately decides to give priority to his identification with Indians seeking independence from British rule over his identity as a trained barrister pursuing English legal justice. Or when E.M. Foster famously, some would say notoriously, I would not, but famously concludes, I quote, "If I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country," unquote. Quite often, however, the choice is implicit and obscure, and less grandly defended, but they are acts of choice nevertheless. The existence of choice does not presume that there are no constraints that restrict choice. Indeed, choices are always made within the limits of what are seen as feasible. The feasibilities in the case of identities will depend on individual characteristics and circumstances. Mahatma Gandhi could not have assumed the identity of a British police officer in the Raj busting up meetings of anti-colonial protest, though he did actually reflect on what it would be like to be such a person. That infeasibility did not, however, eliminate Gandhi's need to choose between the identity of an Indian agitating for independence from the Raj and that of a London-trained barrister quietly practicing English law. We know certain things about ourselves, but we still have to decide on the priorities to be given to the different connections, affiliations, and associations that are all open to us. We have to choose within the constraints that limits our option. For example, I tend to believe I cannot assume the identity of a blue-eyed Icelandic woman who is comfortable with 6-month-long nights. But that I don't regard as a major reduction of my choice. And this fact that we have to choose is indeed not a remarkable recognition. It's utterly unremarkable. That is just the way every choice in every field is actually faced. Indeed, nothing can be more elementary and universal than the fact that choices of all kinds in every area are always made within particular limits. For example, when we decide what to buy in the markets, we can hardly ignore the fact that there are limits on how much we can spend. The budget constraint, as economists call it, is omnipresent. The fact that every buyer has to make choices does not indicate that there is no budget constraint, but only that choices have to be made within the budget constraint the person faces. What is true in elementary economics is also true in complex political and social decisions. Even when one is inescapably seen by oneself as well as by others as French or Jewish or Brazilian or African American, or particularly in the context of present-day turmoils, as an Arab or as a Muslim, one still has to decide what exact importance to attach to that identity over the relevance of other categories to which one also belongs. The priority over distinct identities is something a person has to determine one way or another rather than detect as a fact of nature. If choices do exist, and yet it is assumed that they are not there, the use of reasoning may well be replaced by uncritical acceptance of conformist behavior, no matter how rejectable they may be. Typically, such conformism tends to have conservative implications and work in the direction of protecting old customs and practices from intelligent scrutiny. Indeed, traditional inequalities, such as unequal treatment of women in sexist societies, or discrimination against members of other racial groups or of other castes, survived by the unquestioning acceptance of received identities, including subservient roles of the traditional underdog, which can prevent critical examination. But the unquestioned presumptions are, in these cases, merely unquestioned. They are not, in any sense, unquestionable. Many past practices and assumed identities have crumbled in response to questions and scrutiny. Traditions can shift even within a particular country and culture. It is perhaps worth recollecting that John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, published in 1874, was taken by many of his British readers to be the ultimate proof of his eccentricity. And as a matter of fact, the interest on the subject was so little that this, The Subjection of Women, is the only book of John Stuart Mill on which his publisher lost money. However, the unquestioning acceptance of a social identity may not always have traditionalist implications. It can also involve a radical reorientation in identity, which could then be accepted as a piece of alleged discovery without reasoned choice. My disturbing memories of Hindu-Muslim riots in India in the 1940s, to which I referred earlier, included seeing with the eyes of a bewildered child massive identity shifts that followed divisive politics. A great many persons' identities as Indians, as subcontinentals, as Asians, or members of the human race seem to give way quite suddenly to sectarial identification with Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh communities. The carnage that followed had much to do with elementary herd behavior by which people were made to, quote-unquote, discover the newly detected belligerent identities without subjecting the process to critical scrutiny. The same people were suddenly different. Similarly, unreasoned identity shifts have occurred and are continuing to occur in different parts of the world today, in the former Yugoslavia, in the Middle East, in Rwanda, in Congo, in varying forms with devastating effects. There's something deeply debilitating about denying choice when choice does exist, for it is an abdication of responsibility to consider and assess how one should think and what one should identify with. It is a way of falling prey to unreasoned shifts in alleged self-knowledge based on a false belief that one identity is to be discovered and accepted rather than examined and rationally scrutinized. A remarkable use of imagined singularity can be found in the basic classificatory idea that serves as the intellectual background to the much-discussed thesis of the clash of civilizations. This thesis, which is so often invoked now with profound effects on attitudes and politics, has had various forms of airing, but the most influential presentation of it can be found in my colleague Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilization and the Remaking of the World Order, published in 1996. The thesis had some following even before the mind-boggling terrorism of September 11, 2001. But after those events, many have read in them some kind of, read in that thesis, some kind of a vindication of the idea that civilizations are in deep conflict with each other. The devised civilizational classification closely follow, in fact, religious divisions. Huntington contrasts Western civilization with clearly Judeo-Christian overtone, with Islamic civilization, as he calls it, Hindu civilization, as he calls it again, Buddhist civilization, and so on, with a few hybrid categories thrown in, such as the Cynic or Japanese civilizations. The alleged confrontations of religious differences are incorporated into a carpentered vision of one dominant and hardened divisiveness. As it happens, the people of the world can be classified according to many competing systems of partitioning, each of which has some sometimes far-reaching relevance in our lives, such as nationalities, location, classes, occupation, social status, languages, literatures, politics, and many others. While religious categories have received much airing in recent years, they cannot be presumed to obliterate other distinctions, and even less can they be seen as the only relevant system of classifying people across the globe. In partitioning the people of the world into those belonging to the Islamic world, the Western world, the Hindu world, the Buddhist world, etc., the divisive power of classificatory priority is implicitly used to place people firmly inside a unique set of rigid boxes. Other divisions, say between the rich and the poor, between members of different classes and occupation, between people of different politics, between distinct nationalities and residential location, between language groups, etc., are all submerged by this allegedly primal way of seeing the differences between people. The difficulty with the thesis of the clash of civilization begins well before we come to the issue of an inevitable clash. It begins with the presumption of the unique relevance of a singular classification or categorization. Indeed, the question, do civilizations clash, is founded on the presumption that humanity can be preeminently and usefully classified into distinct and discrete civilizations, and that relations between different human beings can be somehow seen without serious loss of understanding in terms of relations between different civilizations. The basic flaw of the thesis much precedes the point when it is asked whether civilizations must clash, a question that is conceptually parasitic on the commanding power of a singular categorization. No matter what answer we propose to give to the question, do civilizations clash, the form of the query itself pushes us into a narrow and a deceptive way of thinking about the people of the world, partitioning them into fixed categories in terms of civilizational identification, overlooking every other identity that a person has. This reductionist view is typically combined, as will be more fully discussed in the second lecture, with an extraordinarily foggy perception of world history, amazingly foggy in fact, which overlooks internal diversities and the contact between between the different civilizations. The bemused perception of history also goes with overlooking a great deal of mutual interactions, intellectual as well as material, between different cultures. And its power to befuddle can trap not only those who would like to support the thesis of a clash, varying from Islamic fundamentalists to Western supremacists, but also those who would like to dispute it, but try to respond within the straitjacket of its pre-specified terms of reference. The limitations of such civilization-based thinking can prove to be just as treacherous for programs of quote-unquote dialogue among civilizations, something that seems to be much sought after these days, as they are for theories of a clash of civilizations. The noble and elevating search for amity among people, seen as amity between civilizations, speedily reduces many-sided human beings into one dimension each, and muzzles the variety of involvements that have provided rich and diverse grounds for cross-border interactions over many centuries, indeed millennia, including the arts, literature, science, mathematics, games, politics, and other arenas of shared human interest. Well-meaning attempts at pursuing global peace can have very counterproductive consequences when these attempts are founded on a seriously impoverished understanding of human beings. Increasing reliance on religious-based classification of the people of the world also tends to make the Western response to global terrorism and conflict peculiarly ham-handed. Respect for quote-unquote other people is shown by praising their religious books, rather than by taking note of the many-sided involvement and achievements in non-religious as well as religious fields of different people in a globally interactive world. To focus just on the grand religious classification is not only to miss other significant concerns and ideas that move people, it also has the effect of generally magnifying the voice of religious authority at a time when religiosity is one of the principal areas of divisiveness marshaled for the cause of terrorism and violence. The Muslim clerics are then treated as ex officio spokesmen for the so-called Islamic world, even though a great many people who happen to be Muslim by religion have profound differences with what is proposed by one mullah or another. The same would apply to any attempt to understand the views and judgments of Christians or Hindus or Jews by relying on what their religious leaders demand as spokespeople for their respective quote-unquote flocks. The singular classification gives a commanding voice to the establishment figures in the respective religious hierarchy, while other less religious speakers are muted and muffled in a world defined as a federation of religions. The growing role of religious politics often ends up being reinforced rather than restrained by the tendency of many Western governments to give powerful political role to religious spokesmen on behalf of, quote unquote, their people. In confronting what in the thoroughly muddled vocabulary of contemporary global politics is called Islamic terrorism, the strategic force of Western policy seems to concentrate on trying to define or redefine Islam. The exercise of distortion can take the form of crude beliefs, well exemplified by US Lieutenant General William Boykin's buoyant and by now well-known remarks describing his battle against Muslims with disarming coarseness. I quote, "I knew that my God was bigger than his," unquote, and that the Christian God, I quote, was a real God and the Muslims was an idol, unquote, revealing also, going on to reveal to the world the alarming understanding of General Boykin that, quote, Satan was masterminding Islamic terrorism because he wants to destroy us as a Christian army, unquote. The idiocy of such unadorned bigotry is, of course, easy to diagnose. And for this reason, there is, I believe, less harm done by the hurling of such unguided missiles. In contrast with the more sophisticated guided missile that present a nobler vision in trying to woo Muslim activists away from opposition through the apparently benign strategy of defining Islam appropriately. They try to wrench Islamic terrorists from violence by insisting that Islam is a religion of peace, that I quote unquote, true Muslim must be a tolerant individual, so come off it and be peaceful. The rejection of a confrontational reading of Islam is, of course, entirely appropriate today and extremely important. But we must also ask whether it is at all necessary or useful to try to define what a true Muslim must be like. A person's religion need not be his or her all-encompassing and exclusive identity. In particular, Islam as a religion does not obliterate responsible choice for Muslims in many spheres of life. Indeed, it's possible for one Muslim to take a very confrontational view and other to be extremely tolerant of heterodoxy, without either of them ceasing to be a Muslim for that reason alone. This is not only because the idea of ijtihad, or religious interpretation, allows considerable latitude, but also because there are many choices and decisions, particularly in political and social matters, in which being a Muslim does not yield any rigid answer that leaves no room for internal argument or dissent. The response to Islamic fundamentalism and to the terrorism linked with it also becomes particularly confused when there is a general failure, as there is, I'm afraid, to distinguish between Islamic history and the history of Muslim people. Muslims, like all other people in the world, have many different pursuits, and not all their priorities and values need be placed within the singular identity of being Islamic. It's of course not surprising at all that the champions of Islamic fundamentalism would like to suppress all other identities of Muslims in favor of being only Islamic. But it is extremely odd that those who want to overcome the tensions and conflicts linked with Islamic fundamentalism also seem unable to see Muslim people in any form other than their being just Islamic, which is then combined with attempts to redefine that religion, rather than seeing the many-dimensional nature of diverse human beings who happen to be Muslims. People see themselves and have reason to see themselves in very many different ways. For example, a Bangladeshi Muslim is not only a Muslim but also a Bengali and a Bangladeshi, typically quite proud of the Bengali language, literature, and music, not to mention the other identities that she or she may have connected with class, gender, occupation, politics, aesthetic taste, and so on. Bangladesh's separation from Pakistan was not based on religion at all, since the Muslim identity was shared by the bulk of population in the two wings of undivided pre-partition Pakistan. The separatist issues related to language, to literature, and to politics. Even today, the competing loyalties of Bengali culture and secular commitments on the one hand, and the invocation of Islamic fundamentalism on the other, are locked in a serious political combat for the minds and hearts of a great many people in Bangladesh. And we cannot begin to understand the nature of that social encounter within the framework of religion-based categorization, which would see Bangladeshis simply as Muslims and nothing else. Similarly, there is no empirical reason at all why champions of the Muslim past, or for that matter, of the Arab heritage, have to concentrate specifically on religious beliefs only, and not also on, for example, science and mathematics, to which Arab and Muslim societies have contributed so very much, and which can also be a part of a Muslim or an Arab identity. Even today, when a modern mathematician here in Berkeley invokes an algorithm to solve a difficult computational problem, she helps to commemorate the contributions of the 9th century Arab and Muslim mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name the term algorithm is derived. The term algebra, incidentally, comes from his book, Al-Jabr wa al-Muqabila. Despite the importance of this heritage, crude classifications have tended to put science and mathematics in the basket of Western science and civilization, leaving other people to mine their pride in religious depths. If the disaffected Arab activists today can take pride only in the purity of Islam, rather than in the many-sided richness of Arab history, the unique prioritization of religion, shared by warriors on both sides, plays a major part in incarcerating people within the enclosure of a singular identity. Even the frantic Western search for quote-unquote the moderate Muslim, which you see so much written about these days, confounds moderation in political beliefs with moderateness of religious faith. A person can have extremely strong religious faith, Islamic or any other, along with very tolerant politics. The failure to recognize the plurality of human identities and the far-reaching role of choice, reflection, and reasoned decisions about the competing demands of distinct identities involving non-religious as well as religious consideration extracts a very heavy price. The illusion that the diagnosis and implications of identity are matters of discovery and destiny makes the world much more incendiary than it need be. In the second lecture, I shall try to say a bit more on the confusion generated by the illusory presumption of predetermined singular identities, but also go on to attempt to present a more general analysis of how we can try to make sense of identity-based thinking. The positive contributions of the idea of identity have to be understood even as we resist the confusions and the violence that identity-based thinking has often tended to generate. That is for tomorrow. Thank you.
My name is John Vandenacker, and I guess what I got from what you're saying is that you seem to think that identities are concrete categories. And what I'd like to ask is, how is it that you suggest that people could construct identities that are permeable in the sense that we can trade information between identities and in that way create bridges between groups rather than wars?
Well, I think you're asking a question which is very important, but it's not really closely connected with my thesis. You are saying that suppose we divide people in one categories and they're different groups, how could they talk to each other? And of course, the amity of civilizations would be one example of that. I'm arguing that that may not be the best way of proceeding, because by the time you've classified the people of the world into, Muslim civilization, Hindu civilization, Western civilization, and so on, you have overlooked a great many other features of the people. So that is the plurality of identities and the choices that we have to consider in that context that have to come to play. Now, there is a bearing on that even when you are talking, as it were, communication between, say, Western civilization and Islamic civilization, the fact that there are shared interests in other spheres might play a part. But that does not, I think, justify being the ability to rely on one singular, predetermined, unchosen, discovered destiny of classification in the category. So that's the thing that I was trying to focus on, and you are raising an important but a somewhat different question.
All right. I think maybe you misunderstood what I was asking, but so I'll restate it another way. What I was trying to get at is, I agree with what you're saying in that by classifying people discretely, we create problems with identification. And that, like, the moment that we classify, people change. Tomorrow they change, the weather changes, everything changes. So how can we create permeability? I think that's what I was asking.
Yeah. My position isn't so much that we shouldn't classify people, but we shouldn't, classification is the basis of almost all kinds of knowledge, we know, categorization. But it's the insistence on one unique categorization. Even religious classification is an important classification. When it becomes difficult is that when it preempts every other form of classification. So really, I'm not asking for not classification, I'm asking for more classification, many, 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 many more. And I will argue in the second lecture that the hope for peace in the world does not really rest, ultimately, I'm giving away my theme, but since it's not a detective story, that's all right maybe, that the hope of peace in the world doesn't lie primarily in denying that people are different, but to recognize they're differently different. And there are a great many different ways in which people could be seen. And it's the plurality of our divisions which ultimately, I think, is the source of our stability and peace.
Good afternoon. My name is Linda Hess. I teach at Stanford. You suggested that the solution you're going to develop in the next lecture has to do with the development of multiple identities and resisting of singular identities. So it sounds like an educational project. When I think of the ways in which religious and ethnic-based violence are fomented successfully, when I think of my friends in India who've said to me, not despairingly, but dismally, the left has really failed. The right has done a much better job than we have. When I think of why they say that, the organizing for ethnic and religious-based violence takes advantage, it comes from manipulation and from cultivation of anger and fear. Is an educational project possibly going to counter that? That's what the left keeps trying to do.
Yeah. Linda, I think I agree with you, but let me clarify a little bit as to what I was saying. It's not that I'm trying to propose a solution. I'm trying to analyze in which direction a resistance to identity-based violence may optimally or may sensibly lie. I'm not a chair of the United Nations Committee, which is going to end up with a report about let's do these things.
We keep hoping you'll do that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. But it's to analyze, but the distinction isn't very great. To analyze which way the overcoming of these violences may lie. Having said that, the best I entirely agree with you, and in the sense that it's not so much developing multiple identities. We have these identities, I'm an economist, middle income resident in 2 Cambridges with great confusion as a result. Indian citizen and left or center in politics and so on. All these things, all these features exist. I'm not developing them. It's a question of recognizing their claim to my attention and how I might play it and how I must resist, therefore, the idea that one of them is predetermined naturally to me, my real identity. The rest of them is not a matter of recognition. They may be a matter of thought, but they could never, as Michael Sandel puts it, never have the status of being your identity, because identity is a matter of discovery. That I'm resisting. But I think we are totally on the same line, that it involves, what I'm trying to suggest is an educational change, but education not just in the sense of schooling, because every conversation, every bit of public reasoning is a matter of broadening our horizon. And there's democracy, not just in the form of voting. I'll have something to say on that tomorrow. Democracy, we see just as the voting is a great mistake, and that's why the history of democracy is confounded by trying to look for voting. Even that goes often wrong, trying to read the Athenian experience, but not seeing what its historical implications were for the rest of the world. But in addition to that, there's a long history of public discussion right across the globe. And then these can be seen as part of politics, but these are also, in your sense and in my sense, educational efforts. So when you were referring to people saying, the left has failed and right now, if they're discussing economic policies, etc., there may be a reason to discuss. That is nationalization, right policy, privatization, is globalization a good thing, bad thing? We could have a debate on that. But that I don't want to block off. And yet, to say that the left has failed and the right has succeeded, and particularly you seem to be discussing it in the context of intolerant right, not so much the capitalist market right, not the
right. We're talking about
not the Manchester liberals right, but the right of the exclusive fundamentalist kind, including in the case of India, Hindu fundamentalism. To say that they have prevailed, and therefore that's my identity. I used to think I'm an Indian, now I think I'm a Hindu, etc. That would be an utterly confounded way of thinking about it, and you and I entirely agree. And what it requires is engagement in discussion. And that's really what I want to hope to discuss a bit more in tomorrow's talk. Thank you very much, Linda.